Welcome to the Arizona Author Series. This event was recorded on February 15th, 2024. The Arizona Author Series is supported by the Arizona State Library, Archives, and Public Records, a division of the Secretary of State, with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are pleased to hear from Ken Mochizuki, author of the book Michi Challenges History, From Farm Girl to Costume Designer to Relentless Seeker of the Truth, the life of Michi Nishiura Weglyn. Born and raised in Seattle, Washington, and a graduate of the University of Washington, Ken Mochizuki is the author of the award-winning and best-selling picture books Baseball Saved Us, Heroes, and Passage to Freedom, the Sugihara Story. He also wrote the young adult novel Beacon Hill Boys, the graphic novel Those Who Helped Us, and the nonfiction biography for young readers, Michi Challenges History. Previously, as a journalist, he had extensively covered the Japanese-American World War II experience and Asian-Pacific American history. We are pleased to hear from Mr. Mochizuki and glad you can join us.
Okay. Now this came out about a year ago, and on the back jacket flap, there's a quote from me that says, "I've always held admiration for those who walk away from the good life to a higher calling that promises no material rewards. Michi Nishiura Weglyn was that kind of person. The more I researched her life story, the more I learned how astounding she really was." I started doing her story as a picture book, and then it was spring of 2019 that an editor expressed interest in the story, Simon Boughton, who's the editorial director at Norton Young Readers. And he saw my picture book version and he said, well, it's just providing clues as to who she was. I want to know more. So he wanted to expand it into the middle grade reader that it became. And so that meant I had to go to the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, where Michi's collection is at. And lucky for me and all of us, Michi saved everything. So most of the photos you're going to see are from that collection. Okay, why am I not advancing?
You should be able to, maybe if you push enter or your arrow keys, you should be
Yeah,
able to.
right. Yeah, it's still not moving.
Oh no. Would you like to maybe stop sharing and then try to reshare?
Yeah, right. That's what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
Okay. Still doesn't move.
When you do your share screen, can you open it not in the slideshow?
Right, that's
not
what
as
I'm
a
trying
as
now.
there you go. And now go to slideshow up at the top.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There you go. Perfect. And then from the beginning. And now I bet it'll.
Oh, don't you just love tech?
Yes. So let's try that one more time. Oh, I see up at the top, just above that, do you see a little square box up at the top above the red?
Yeah, slideshow.
So if you click on resume slideshow.
Okay.
Let's see
Okay.
There we go.
I think we're in business.
Thanks for your patience, everybody.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. In the beginning of the book, these are the Japanese for the generations. So you're going to hear me say Issei, and that's the immigrants from Japan. And they couldn't become American citizens or naturalized American citizens until 1952. That was the federal law. And their children, the Nisei, and they were born in the United States, and that made them U.S. citizens. Then there are the Kibei, who were Nisei born in the United States, but they were sent by their parents to be educated in Japan, and then they returned to America. And the Sansei, the children of the Nisei, is the third generation, and I am one of those. This is from Michi's collection, and this is her parents, Tomojiro on the left and Misao and Nishiura. Now, why there were mostly young men that immigrated during the late 19th century and the early 20th. And why did they? Because this was what was known as the Meiji period in Japan, when agriculture was being edged out in favor of industrialization. There were high taxes on farmers. The price of rice dropped drastically, which was Japan's main crop. And there was the growing militarization, where young men were trying to avoid conscription. And there were also unemployed veterans of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. And there was the Japanese custom of the time that the oldest son inherits everything, the family house, business, property, and other sons, while they were left to fend for themselves. And a lot came to America. This is her mother, Misao, and she was a picture bride, based almost entirely on an exchange of photos, and it was arranged by a go-between, or in Japanese, it would be called a baishakunin. The future wife met her future husband for the first time in American port, and usually they married that day or the day after. Now, were some of these picture brides disappointed when they met their future husband in real life? Oh yeah, you better believe it. And Michiko was born in November 1926, and 2 years later, her sister, Tomiko, or Tomi, was born. Michi grew up on a farm in Brentwood, and that was a small farming town midway between Oakland and Stockton in California's San Joaquin Valley. And her family were sharecroppers on a farm of some 500 acres, growing cucumbers, tomatoes, apricots, cantaloupes. Back then, the Japanese parents hoped for a son to carry on the family name, and when he grew up, to be more help, especially on the farm. And where Michi grew up, there were a lot of animals on the farm, not only dogs and cats, but there was also a lot of chickens and horses. And Michi did work to show she was good as any son, and did other work on the farm. And she always loved animals. And then she saw some chickens born without feathers. So she designed and made furry little sweaters for them. And that's one of the amazing ironies in her life, that she would later go on to become an acclaimed costume and wardrobe designer. And then she was interviewed in a 1961 issue of TV Guide. And she told this story that she was always fascinated by costumes, those Ziegfeld Follies movies. So she and her sister Tommy begged her mother to see a show, and she didn't name the city, but I assume it's Stockton. And they went into town and they looked at all the posters outside the theaters, and they picked the one with the most dazzling costumes to go see that show. Well, it turned out to be a burlesque show. And Simon, my editor, well, he cut that story out. But Michi, as with the tradition at that time, her parents taught her to know her place, especially for a girl, that you do not offend others, and what others thought of you was the most important. So she tried to make herself as less obvious as she could because of her race and because of her social status. Her parents were just sharecroppers. So one thing she could control was being the best student that she could. And after she wrote an essay about the U.S. Constitution, and because of the student that she was awarded this award from the American Legion in 1940. Well, then the attack on Pearl Harbor took place on December 7th, 1941. And like most Nisei, or Japanese American students going to school, they wondered if they should even go to school the next day because they were of Japanese descent. But luckily for Michi, her teacher knew the difference between Japanese from Japan and Japanese in America. and said that the Japanese American students were not to be mistreated. As early as December, as the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, the FBI began rounding up Japanese, or the Issei, the immigrants, community leaders. And how they knew exactly where they were and where they lived or where they worked, that means that the FBI had them under surveillance. And evidence shows that it could be up to a good 10 years before. You were a community leader if you were president of a social club, or you were a publisher of a Japanese language newspaper, or you were a Buddhist priest because Buddhism was considered the religion of the enemy. You know, martial arts instructors, or somebody who had more than usual contact with Japan, the country of Japan, and especially the Japanese military. And then by mid-April, that Michi's family saw the notices that they had to leave, be removed from where they lived, and they could only take what they could carry. So if they couldn't store what they owned, their possessions, they had to leave it there and get nothing for it, or get what they could. So, as was all the Japanese American communities at this time, they held fire sales, selling everything. And strangers swooped in and bought everything for ridiculously low prices. One stranger offered a quarter apiece for their chickens. Their mother thought that was an insult, and instead, Michi's mother decided to eat as many of the chickens as they could before they had to leave. And the orders were all those of Japanese descent had to be removed from the west side of Washington, Oregon, all of California, and the southern third, about the southern third of Arizona. Michi's family was brought to the staging area, which was a nearby town called Byron, California. And they were eventually taken to the Turlock in what was called an assembly centers, operated by the U.S. Army and surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers with machine guns pointed into the camp. Michi's family lived in one room, and everything was done communally. You used the latrines together, you ate together, you showered together. And then after 3.5 months at Turlock, her family was transferred by train for 2 days and nights to the permanent camp, which was called by the government the Gila River War Relocation Center. And this was miles south of Phoenix. Rivers was the closest town, and it was built on about 16,500 acres within the Gila River Indian Reservation. And it was divided into 2 sections. One on the west was called Butte, and the other was called Canal. And this camp held up to 13,000 people. There was another camp further west, Poston, 12 miles south of the town of Parker and 3 miles east of the Colorado. It was built on about 71,000 acres on the Colorado River Reservation, and it held up to 18,000. And for most of the war, this was the largest camp as far as population. And this is a photo of Michi there on the right, and her sister Tony by their barrack building. And Michi's family lived in one 16 by 20 room with another family of 4 in the same room in the what was called the Butte camp. And Michi remembers that being that it was the desert, and with all that sand, it was like walking in a flour barrel. And the temperature sometimes got up to 120 degrees. And Michi carried an umbrella, not only to shade herself from the sun, but also to use as a shield against the constant dust storms. And Michi would later say of that experience, quote, "I despise deserts and the sun. For years, people didn't understand why I walk in the shade." So Michi attended Butte High School, and all the schools in the camps were a series of barrack buildings. And this was an outdoor session. But an interesting thing happened to Michi. There in the camp, the playing field was leveled. Those of Japanese descent, except for the staff, and they all had to eat the same food, which wasn't good, as they remember. They all had to use the latrines together, the showers together. It didn't matter who you were before you ended up in this camp. You were all the same here. Everybody was equal. So Michi started realizing her potential and being no longer constrained by race or her social class. She started to blossom. And then she formed and became president of a Girl Scout troop there in the camp. And as she recalled, that was something she would never have done back home at Brentwood. And still being the straight A student, she was selected to be one of those to greet First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt when she visited the Gila River camp. And on the back of this photo, Michi had wrote, "And when our First Lady visited, forgotten, when she came among us refusing guards, we knew that she trusted us." But what was Eleanor Roosevelt doing there at Gila River? Well, as it turns out, there were rumors going on in the US government that those in the camps were being coddled, that they had it better than most Americans who were dealing with the stringent war rationing. And it's interesting that I was in contact with the Franklin D. Roosevelt Museum and Library in Hyde Park, New York. And they sent me one of her earlier drafts. She was going to write an essay for Collier's magazine. And then you compare that to how the final version that appeared in the magazine, that she said she found no evidence of coddling. But in the final version, there was no mention of coddling or that she even visited Gila River. There was a statewide organization called Girls League for high school girls. And then Michi was president of the Butte High School chapter. And that's her fourth from the right in the front row. And then she thought up of, why don't we have a statewide convention right here inside the Gila River camp? And that was Michi. Whatever she thought up, she just went and did it. And so on April 18th, 1944, over 500 Arizona descended on Gila River. And according to the Gila News Courier, which was the camp newspaper, this was the breakdown of who attended. As you'll see, most are from within the camp, but then there's others from all over the state. The day started with what's called an exchange of talent, a talent show, individual sports competitions to see who was the best at certain events. And then they ate the camp food together at Butte High School Mess Hall, and they were taken on a tour of the Gila River War Relocation Center. And although Michi never publicly stated it, probably her real intent was to have those outside of the camp to see the inside of the camp. And then they divided it up into discussion groups. And again, according to the Gila News Courier, discussions were conducted in the afternoon with the unanimous conclusion that regardless of race, creed, or color, needs in the camp merit the title of American just as much as any other. They also agreed that although this convention could not have been attended by more, the representatives of the various schools will be able to go back and tell others more about those in relocation centers. That was the government's term for the camp, relocation centers. They felt that the reason for racial prejudice and war was largely due to the lack of education, and this must be built upon as one of the greatest foundations for America in which they shall lead. During these discussions, many of the doubts in the minds of the visitors as to relocation, combat teams, coddling, and such were made much clearer. And the combat teams they were taught was included members of the 442nd, the all-Japanese American combat unit, which fought the Germans in Italy and France and became one of the most decorated units in U.S. Army history. Now, Michi was always a good public speaker. And they had what was called a declamation contest in 1944. And then Michi won this contest. And the speech that she read was a March 30th, 1944 speech delivered by Missouri State Representative O.K. Armstrong on the floor of the Missouri House of Representatives. Armstrong, a U.S. World War I Army veteran, spoke against a proposed legislative bill amendment that sought to remove a doctor of Japanese descent from practicing in the Missouri State Sanitarium, just because he was of Japanese descent. Now, to take a stand like that when the war was still going on, it was unusual, but it was very courageous. And then also the question arises, like, if he gave the speech at the end of March, and then Michi recited it by the beginning of June, how did you find this? And then, well, that was Michi. And another amazing irony in Michi's life was she would end up in a tuberculosis sanitarium about a year and a half later. And by 1943, you can leave the camp by going to school or going for work. And there was an organization called the National Japanese American Student Relocation Council, a consortium of religious groups that made it possible they placed them in colleges. And Michi's English teacher, Mabel Sheldon, always saw Michi's potential and encouraged her to go to college. And in this case, it was Mount Holyoke, a women's college in Massachusetts. Well, Michi's mother told her that she should study more practical skills for women at the time, like typing and shorthand. And this is a photo of Michi in Phoenix. She went to Phoenix to take the entrance exams to Mount Holyoke. But while she was there, she stopped at a drugstore for a soda, and she was told to leave and refuse service because she looked Japanese. And Michi was back in the world outside of the camp. But Michi was accepted on a full scholarship to Mount Holyoke, and at age 17, she left the Gila River camp alone on July 13th, 1944. Mount Holyoke College was founded in 1837 to be the women's equivalent of the Ivy League schools, which were men only at that time. And its founder, Mary Lyon, quoted as saying, "Go where no one else will go, do what no one else would do," which Michi would do later on. And there she was shunned by some for being of Japanese descent because the war was going on. But ironically, one of her best friends, who she considered a big sister, had a brother fighting in the Pacific. She always loved animals, so she concentrated her studies on biology, and she was always a good illustrator. So her teacher encouraged her to be a medical illustrator. And this she would draw later on, but it just goes to show what kind of illustrator she was. There was a campus-wide contest to design the costumes and set for Mount Holyoke's dramatic club and dance group production of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Michi won that contest. Newspaper reviews praised her work, and she decided to then lead a life of what she called, quote, continued applause. But by the end of that year, 1945, she contracted tuberculosis, and she had to spend months in the Glen Gardner Sanitarium. And because she missed all that time from going to school, she had to drop out from Mount Holyoke. Meanwhile, by January of 1945, her family was able to leave Gila River Camp, and they went to Seabrook Farms. Seabrook Farms in Bridgeton, New Jersey, was an industrial city unto itself. It grew its own crop, and they would turn it into frozen foods. And then Seabrook Farms recruited Japanese Americans out of the camps to live and work there, and some 800 Japanese Americans ended up working there. And there were 12-hour shifts. Men were paid 50 cents an hour, women 35 cents an hour. So Michi family there by the summer of 1946 after leaving the sanitarium. And her mother worked on one of the assembly lines, sorting beans. And she saw that they needed something to help keep them awake when the night shift was from 6 p.m. till 6 a.m. And Michi being Michi, which she thought of, she went and did it. She approached management to become a disc jockey, blaring music throughout the company PA system. And one record she played often was Perry Como's hit song of the summer of 1946 called Prisoner of Love. And that's amazing, another amazing irony in her life that 10 years later, she would become Perry Como's wardrobe designer. Well, Michi knew that if she wanted a job, a career in theater, she had to go to the theater capital of the country, New York City. So she, by the end of 1946, enrolled at Barnard College in New York, and then attended the Fashion Academy of New York. And she lived here at the International House, which was a residence for postgraduate students from around the world. And there she met Walter Weglyn. Walter grew up in the town of, pronounced Wim, or it's spelled ULM, a town in southwestern Germany near the major city of Stuttgart. And being that he and his family were Jewish, and when the persecution of Jews was starting to peak, his parents arranged for him and his brother to get out of Germany via the Kindertransport in 1939. His brother eventually made it to England, and Walter ended up in Rotterdam, Holland. He was eventually by a wealthy Dutch Jewish family, but when the Nazis occupied the Netherlands, they were taken away to a concentration camp, and Walter was able to escape. And he spent the next almost 3 years on the run and in hiding. Other families would hide him in closets, ditches, and one family hid him underneath their goat stable. And meanwhile, his parents ended up in Theresienstadt, a Nazi ghetto within the Czechoslovakian city of Terezin. But miraculously, all of the family survived, and Walter immigrated to New York in 1947. And while visiting a friend at the International House, he was introduced to Michi. In 1949, Michi suffered another bout of tuberculosis, and she was confined to the sanitarium at Saranac Lake in New York State. There, visiting Michi, Walter proposed marriage. Now, both sets of parents were initially against the marriage, and interracial marriage was still illegal in over half of the states in America. But when Michi's mother met Walter, she thought that he was, as Michi remembered, quote, more Japanese than Japanese because of his selflessness and concern for others. So Walter and Michi were married on March 5th, 1940, near Washington, D.C. And they decided they would never have children because they didn't want their children to go through what they did with the Holocaust and the incarceration of Japanese Americans, not that far removed at that time. Walter and Michi lived in New York, and Walter worked as his lifelong career as a perfume chemist. And Michi could not find a job as a costume designer until 1952. One of the producers that she left her illustrations with was Arthur Noer, producer of the Roxy Theater on Broadway. But Michi received a call from him on Thanksgiving Day, said he remembered her, and said he needed drawings for costume ideas for an upcoming ice skating show called Ice Colorama. So as Michi remembered it, being that it was Thanksgiving Day, she was eating a turkey drumstick with one hand and drawing with the other. Well, Ice Colorama was a big hit. And so Michi then worked as a costumer for other Broadway productions and nightclubs, including Copacabana. And then she worked on her first TV show in 1954, Kraft Television Theater. And she worked for stars, some of the biggest stars of the 50s, Eddie Fisher, Patty Page, Tony Bennett. And she had developed what she called her camera eye, meaning how would the costumes look on the TV screen? And the TV screen, she said, had a tendency to, quote, shorten people. And starting in 1956, she was hired for the popular Perry Como show. And she worked there for almost 10 years. And she did the wardrobes for some of the biggest stars of the time, including Dinah Shore, Bob Hope, Ginger Rogers. And she was in demand because she knew how to use clothes to make the wearer look better. In that interview with TV Guide, she explained her whole approach, which included that solid colors made shorter women look taller, beige or tan shoes made legs look longer, and to avoid pleats on pants because that made the men look wider. And then when Perry Como's show moved its production to Los Angeles, Michi decided to stay in New York, where she worked on TV shows there. Then by this time, it was the late 60s. The American involvement in the war in Vietnam was at its peak, and there were the anti-war protests, the civil rights movement. And it was during April 1968, 2 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Michi was watching the news show, Meet the Press, and the guest was this man, U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General in the Lyndon Johnson administration. And there was a rumor going around then that the government was constructing concentration camps for the Blacks, for the African Americans, for those involved in the civil rights movement. So a reporter asked Attorney General Clark that question, is this true? And he responded, we have never had, we do not now have, and we will never have concentration camps in this country. While Michi, being that she spent 2 years of her life in one, and then she probably contracted tuberculosis because of all the dust there, and she was in frail health for the rest of her life, she either shouted out or thought, but she went ballistic. And she said, he's not going to. And also at the same time, she was reading this book, about 6 Million Died. And this came out in 1967. And as it says on the cover, the untold story about the deliberate obstruction placed in the way of attempts to save the Jewish people from Hitler's final solution. And as the author, Arthur D. Morris, would say in the book, it was about the Roosevelt administration's inaction to save those fleeing the Holocaust. So comparisons began forming in Michi's mind. Is there something we don't know here that the Roosevelt administration did when it came to the camps for Japanese Americans? But what could she do about it? She was a clothing designer. She wasn't an academic or a journalist, but Walter, her husband, the Holocaust survivor, encouraged, you want to find out, go do it. So Michi went first where anybody would go, to the New York Public Library. And she found that a lot of the footnotes led her to the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library and Museum at Hyde Park, New York. And then Michi's most significant find here was what was called the Munson Report. Roosevelt ordered Curtis B. Munson, special representative of the State Department, to determine the loyalty to the United States of the Japanese America. And during October and November of 1941, Curtis Munson performed 4 weeks of interviews and fact-finding from the military, law enforcement, and intelligence officials up and down the West Coast and in Hawaii. His conclusion that those of Japanese descent on the West Coast and Hawaii were over 90% loyal to the United States, and there was no, quote, Japanese problem. Well, this report was buried by the Roosevelt administration and finally revealed after the war. Another one of Michi's significant finds was a letter from J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, to President Roosevelt, where he said that the planned removal and mass incarceration of all those of Japanese descent would be, quote, based primarily on public political pressure rather than upon factual data. And he also said that all those of the Japanese descent who were suspect, the FBI already had them detained or under surveillance. And the Naval Intelligence also stated that they advocated for the determination of loyalty and detainment be conducted on an individual basis and not remove all those of Japanese descent. And the other main source was the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And if Michi wasn't the first, she was among the first to find that in early 1942, when the Japanese military was scoring victory upon victory in the Pacific, the U.S. government pressured 14 Latin American countries to round up and deport to the U.S. some of its most prominent male citizens of Japanese descent to be used in prisoner exchanges with Japan. So there were about 2,200 of those, mostly from the country of Peru, who were pretty much abducted in their home countries. And this is a photo when they're in Panama, and then they would be transferred to the United States. And they would stay in camps here in the United States. Now, advocates for this planned removal and incarceration of those descent, the main proponents were President Roosevelt, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Assistant Secretary of War John McCoy, and Navy Secretary Frank Knotts. And those who questioned or were opposed actually this action were Attorney General Francis Biddle and Interior Secretary Harold Ickes. Now, Biddle questioned this whole move, saying that it was a violation of the U.S. Constitution because 2/3 of those being removed, or 73%, were born in this country, and that made them American citizens. And that's when the administration brought in Colonel Carl Ben Detson, who was also an attorney. And he would have the president issue an executive order, but it would become a military matter instead of a legal one, and to designate military areas from which people can be excluded. So this is the first page of Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. And the 82nd anniversary of his issuing this order is February 19th. Now, there was no mention of those of Japanese descent, or that it was targeted at those of Japanese descent. But Michi found a letter from Attorney General Biddle to the president that stated, quote, "This order was never intended to apply to Italians and Germans." But Carl Ben Detson, the architect of this whole move, decreed, if they have one drop of Japanese blood in them, they must go to camp. Now, the question becomes, why didn't this apply to Hawaii, where the attack on Pearl Harbor took place? Well, those of Japanese descent in Hawaii constituted more than 1/3 of the Hawaiian labor force. So if they were all removed from the islands, the whole economy would collapse. And even John McCoy, who became in charge of the camps, agreed. Now, in 1943, there were what we called isolation centers, prisons within the prison. And then these were separate prisons for government deemed troublemakers. They were separated from their families in the camps. And as Michi noted, the families were all they had left. You ended up in one of these isolation centers for making public statements of disloyalty to the U.S., influence or instigating others to oppose the camp administrations, or appearing in any way to favor the enemy of Japan. And Michi found the case of one boy whose father had committed suicide in one of the camps because, quote, he had written a bitter essay which had fallen into the hands of authorities. And these isolation centers, the first one was at Moab, Utah, and then it was later moved to Luke, Arizona, into a former Indian boarding school, which this is. Now, Michi had said, what I wanted to do was break new ground by thrusting deeper into the dark, hushed chapter that was Tule Lake. Tule Lake was one of the camps, one of the 10, in northeastern California, almost on the Oregon border. And the Nisei who actually went through this experience, who were in the camps, usually they rarely talk about those days. And then even more so, Tule Lake. And this is why. I have to back up a little to explain what happened here. In February of 1943, all those 17 and older in the camps had to answer what was called a questionnaire. And at the end, while the questions asked the connections to Japan organizations that belong with, what you read, and then at the end, the second to the last question was, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Well, that was straightforward. Either you did or you didn't. And those who answered no was because, well, what happened to them? Where they ended up at. And then the last question, question 28 said, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces? That was straightforward. It was pretty much the same as the previous question. But it went on to ask, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor. Now, for the Nisei, that really threw them, or some of them, because being born in the United States and they have never been to Japan, they never had any allegiance to the Japanese emperor to begin with. Now, if they answered yes to this question, will it be admitting that they once did? So they thought it was a loaded question. So there was quite a few that answered no. And if you answered no to both of these questions, you became known as a no-no. And you were sent by the government to Tule Lake. They began moving all those who answered no-no during the fall of 1943. And they transferred those who were already in Tule Lake to other camps to make room for the no-nos, or who they called the disloyals. Tule Lake became what the government called a maximum security segregation center. 18,000 people were crammed in a camp meant for 15,000. And also among them were about 3,000 what were called renunciants, whom, after they were treated in America, expressed willingness to return to, or in the case of the Nisei, who had never been there, to go to Japan. And after a farm truck accident that killed one farm worker who was being detained in the camp, there was a strike for better conditions, which led to a demonstration by over 5,000 those in the camp. 3 days later, the army moved in, arresting what they called, quote, anti-administration belligerents. And they were taken to a stockade, a prison within the prison, without any charges being filed. And in researching the events at Tule Lake, Michi received immense help from two American Civil Liberties Union lawyers who had been investigating the camp at the time, Ernest Bessick and Wayne Collins. And Michi noted that Wayne Collins smuggled this photo out of Tule Lake. And the ACLU, as a national organization, did not come to the defense of the Japanese Americans, but individual ACLU lawyers did, such as Wayne Collins and Ernest Bessick. In July of 1944, Bessick visited Tule Lake and learned of the presence of this stockade, and that some had to live in tents during the cold winters in the desert. And he also found that the loyals and disloyals were mixed together, while those in the camp had repeatedly advocated to camp officials to separate them. Well, that resulted in pro-Japan groups being formed. They figured that we might as well go somewhere where we're wanted. And the pro-Japan group in the Tule Lake camp was called the Hoshidan, that formed and made up of Issei and Kibe. They taught Japanese language, culture, held calisthenics at 6 a.m., staged pro-Japan demonstrations. And then they forced or coerced or just plain forced others in the camp to renounce their American citizenship and be willing to go to Japan. In 1945, Wayne Collins arrived and learned of the forced renunciations. and took on almost 1,000 cases to reverse the renunciations. And in federal court, he first had 987 deportations prevented. And over the next 14 years after the war, he had 4,978 of the Nisei renunciants having their American citizenship restored. And Michi will later write about Tootley Lake. The failure of camp authorities to institute protective measures in the interests of the large neutral majority ended up in a veritable reign of terror. Now, all this she included in her book, Years of Infamy. Now, she tried to get a publisher, and she submitted her manuscript to publishers, and how many is not known, but some say it could have been about 100. And when rejecting it, they described her book as, quote, objectionable. And objectionable to whom, Michi was quoted as remarking. So after 8 years of researching, writing, and trying to find a publisher, Years of Infamy, The Untold Story of America's Concentration Camps, was published and released by William Morrow and Company in 1976. One of the reasons why he said that she wrote this book was so that the Nisei would get angry about what had happened to them. And it wasn't anything they had done. It was all totally on the government. So in addition to earning praise, the book was a major boost for what was called the redress movement, an approximately 18-year national effort by Japanese Americans and their allies to get the U.S. government to admit that what it did to those of Japanese descent during World War II was wrong. And that effort culminated in President Reagan signing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, calling for an apology to those of Japanese Americans affected by the U.S. government actions and who were still alive at the time when the bill was signed. And they also received a $20,000 reparation check. But Michi didn't stop there. Through her research on Years of Infamy, she also found that Issei, mostly away from the exclusion zone, and they didn't have to go to camps, working on the railroads and mines further inland in the United States. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they were summarily fired and along with their families evicted from company housing, leaving them homeless. Michi began her letter writing campaign, seeking redress, the same redress for these workers. And she went all the way to the top, writing a letter to President Bill Clinton. And these railroad and mine workers did receive redress in 1998. And there was the case of the Japanese Latin Americans. When they arrived in the United States, they were stripped of their passports. Then after the war ended, most of them were from Peru, and the Peruvian government refused to let them back into their country. And the United States declared them illegal aliens, and they couldn't stay. Again, attorney Wayne Collins, one of America's greatest civil rights lawyers, interceded. He went all the way to President Truman, and they were allowed to stay. But Michi fought for them to receive the same redress that the Japanese Americans did. And that's a fight that's still going on to this day to get them redress. And Michi also fought for the exoneration of the Nisei draft resistors. Nisei were drafted out of the camps beginning in January of 1944. 315 refused until their American rights and those of their families were restored. And this is a photo of the Wyoming federal courthouse. And they were tried in federal courts, and most had to spend up to 3 years in a federal penitentiary for taking their stand. And this is when 63 were tried and convicted altogether and sentenced altogether. And when they were released from the federal prisons, then they were treated as pro-national and Japanese American community for the stand that they took. And by the Japanese American Citizens League, the oldest and most influential civil rights and social organization in the country. So Michi began another letter writing campaign. And in 2002, the National Japanese American Citizens League issued a formal apology. After the publication of Years of Infamy, she began receiving honorary degrees from colleges and universities from all over the country. And one honorary degree that she received in 1994 was from Mount Holyoke College. She finally received a degree. Her husband, Walter, who supported and worked with Michi on all that she did, died of brain cancer in 1995. In 1998, Michi was diagnosed with stomach cancer. Michi had said, "Death isn't bad, it's getting there, that's hell." And she passed away during April of 1999. Michi had said, "By reading the life histories of individuals who have excelled in bettering the human condition, you will find their tragedies and triumphs to be a constant source of empowerment." Well, as it turns out, she was talking about herself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So my name is Diana, and Yam's having some computer issues, so I'm gonna take over for her.
Oh, her too?
Yeah. Technology, right?
Yep.
So we just have a couple of questions. So if you could, where could people learn more about Japanese American internment and Japanese American culture and history?
Oh, wow. There's a lot of sources. Go to this website called Densho, DENSHO, and they're the website that has anything and everything about this period in history. And they'll point you to a lot of resources. Probably the book I always cite about the whole camp issue is the government report. It's called the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, and it's the commission's official report, but it doesn't read like a government report. It's very readable, and that's the most comprehensive coverage of the story.
Okay. What inspired you to research Michi's story?
Well, as I read my own quote in the beginning, I always had admiration for those who were living the good life. They were like in an how do you say it? A family of aristocracy.
Yeah.
Yeah, or royalty. And then they walked away from all of that because of some higher calling or higher purpose that they just had to pursue with no guarantee of any results. Some of our major religious figures in world history were those cases. And so I was even considering a person out of world history like Saint Francis of Assisi. He was one of those. And then I ran into Michi's story, and then hey, same thing. She was a costume and wardrobe designer in showbiz on the top of her game, but she walked away from all that to pursue this higher purpose to find out what really happened to her and all the rest of the Japanese Americans. So I heard her story, then I started researching her story, and then, well, first I had to read her book, Years of Infamy. And then in the book, I was looking for more of what I can learn about her than maybe the facts she was presenting. And the more I researched her story, the more fascinating it became, and how amazing her life was, as I was pointing out, all those amazing ironies in her life. And then when I went to the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles and saw her collection, it was brought in by a series of carts, and they talk about being inside the gold mine. It was fascinating, and especially to actually hold in her hands what was hers. And so Yeah, and good thing Michi saved everything. I mean, everything. Any stories done about her in newspapers, magazines, or whatever it was, they were there. And so that was, that's where I acquired most of my information from, or just reading those interviews with her.
Okay. What surprised you most when you were researching Michi and her story?
Well, I think I pointed some of those out. I mean, well, a lesson here is that when you start going through the websites and it starts running out, it starts going on to other subjects. Well, keep going because you might find something more. So I got to like about the 35th or so listings when I Googled her name. And then there I found it. It was a page by the Smithsonian. And it had her story, the story written about her. And then she started talking about having mother decided to eat all the chickens when they had to leave home. I said, yeah, this is it. This is it now. And all those great quotes that she had, like people wonder why I always walk in the shade. And it was there. And so also that all other websites, like the contest she won at Mount Holyoke, being designing the costumes and sets for a play, none of those websites knew the name of the play. And then I go to her actual collection, and it was Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. So yeah,
Okay.
it to actually see, and also I have to mention that how did all this what she owned about her, how did all this survive all that constant moving? I mean, she went to Mount Holyoke all the way across the country in Massachusetts. So, did her family bring it with them? I mean, these are boxes and boxes and boxes. And so, but however it happened, we are sure fortunate that they did survive.
It's impressive. All right. Um, I am going to, if you wouldn't mind stopping to share your screen, I am going to share where we can get some more information. And let me just get that up. So everybody should be able to see that screen now. And I'm sure I'm not doing this nearly as good as Yam. But I want to thank you so much for your time, Ken, and all of our attendees for joining us today. So on your screen, you should see a link for a brief survey, which will also be emailed to you all. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. And then the recording of this presentation will be made available on our YouTube channel. So be sure to share the link with friends who may have missed today's presentation as well. And we hope to see you at future events and in our reading rooms. I hope you all have a really wonderful day. And thank you again, Ken.
Yes, thank you, Arizona.